Zaria Monroe found out she owed nearly $2 million when a federal agent knocked on her door at 6 o'clock in the morning. Every loan document carried her signature, line after line, page after page, each one looking exactly like her own handwriting. The man she had loved for 11 years stood behind her in the hallway, pretending to be just as stunned as she was, his hands trembling in a way that almost looked convincing. He did not know one thing about the woman he married. Zaria was a senior accountant, trained to catch a single misplaced decimal in a spreadsheet of 10,000 rows, and it took her only 30 seconds to notice the first flaw hidden inside that stack of papers. That flaw would end up costing him everything he thought he had already stolen from her, and by the time the truth surfaced completely, he would be the one left with nothing at all. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in the Holloway household, with coffee brewing and the local news murmuring on low volume from the kitchen counter. Zaria was pulling on her blazer, already thinking about a quarterly report due by noon, when the doorbell rang twice in quick succession, sharp and insistent in a way that made her pause mid-step. She assumed it was a delivery, maybe the packages Ethan had ordered for one of his job sites, so she opened the door without checking the peephole first. 2 federal investigators stood on the porch, badges raised, faces carefully neutral in the way that people trained for bad news always seem to be, their eyes scanning past her into the house as though searching for something specific. They asked if she was Zaria Monroe Holloway, and when she said yes, one of them asked to come inside and talk about several loans tied to her Social Security number. She laughed at first, certain there had been some kind of clerical error, the kind that got fixed with one phone call and a little patience, the kind of mistake banks apologized for within a week. The laughter did not last long. The investigators laid out a folder on her dining room table, the same table where she and Ethan had eaten dinner the night before, and one by one, they described the debts attached to her name with a flat, procedural calm that made every word land harder. There was a business loan for his construction company, a second mortgage on a property she had never even seen the deed for, a line of credit opened at a bank 3 states away, and an investment guarantee that made her stomach drop the moment she heard the figure attached to it. When they added everything together, the total came to $1,860,000, a number so large it barely felt real, more like a typo than an actual debt hanging over her head. Zaria sat frozen at her own table, staring at signatures that looked exactly like hers, curling in the same familiar way at the end of her last name, dotted with the same small flourish she had used since college. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a quiet warning bell began ringing, one she would not fully understand until much later that same week. Ethan appeared in the doorway a moment later, his hair still damp from the shower, his expression arranging itself into something that resembled shock a beat too perfectly. He crossed the room quickly and wrapped his arms around her, murmuring that he could not understand what was happening, that this had to be some kind of mistake or identity theft, that they would figure it out together, like they always did. His voice carried just the right amount of tremor, his hands just the right amount of tightness around her shoulders, and for a few seconds, Zaria let herself lean into that comfort, because 11 years of marriage had taught her to trust the sound of his voice more than her own instincts. But something in the back of her mind, the same part that flagged suspicious transactions during long nights of auditing, refused to fully relax, no matter how convincingly his arms held her. One of the investigators looked directly at Ethan, and then back at Zaria before he spoke his final line for the morning, the one that would replay in her head for weeks afterward. Every signature matched perfectly, he said, which should have been reassuring, except that perfection was exactly what made it impossible, and Zaria understood that better than anyone else standing in that kitchen. Before the 2 agents left, they placed a business card on the counter and told her that a formal notice would follow within the week, outlining every account and every lender involved in the growing case against her. Zaria stood in the doorway long after their car had pulled away from the curb, watching the quiet street outside, as though the neighborhood itself might offer some explanation for what had just happened inside her own home. Ethan hovered nearby, offering to make coffee, offering to call his own attorney immediately, offering anything that might fill the silence stretching between them like a widening crack in glass. She barely heard him, Her mind had already begun working through the numbers on its own, the way it always did whenever something did not add up correctly, and nothing about that morning added up at all. The days that followed felt like walking through a house that had quietly been rearranged while she slept, familiar shapes suddenly holding unfamiliar meaning. Zarya began replaying 11 years of marriage in her mind, searching for the moment the ground had shifted beneath her without her noticing, combing through memories that had once seemed ordinary and now felt loaded with hidden intention. From the very beginning, Ethan had positioned himself as the one who handled the paperwork, the taxes, the insurance renewals, the endless correspondence with banks and lenders that most people found tedious and confusing. He had always framed it as a gift to her, a way of protecting her time so she could focus on her career, and she had accepted that gift gratefully, because building a career as a black woman in corporate finance had already demanded every ounce of energy she had. He would slide papers across the kitchen table with a pen already uncapped, telling her it was just insurance, just a routine tax form, just a small extension on an existing loan they had already discussed together, and she had trusted him the way a person trusts a partner they have shared a decade of mornings with. Now those memories arranged themselves into a different pattern entirely, one that made her hands go cold even in the warmth of her own kitchen. She remembered signing quickly during a commercial break, barely glancing at the fine print because Ethan was standing right there, patient and pleasant, waiting to take the papers back the moment her pen lifted from the page. She remembered him saying it was only a formality, only something the accountant needed, only a signature required to keep a contract moving forward without delay. Phrases that had once sounded reasonable and now sounded rehearsed. At the time, none of it had seemed strange, because trust does not announce its own erosion. It simply accumulates in small, quiet moments, until one day a person wakes up and realizes the foundation beneath them has been hollowed out entirely. Late one night, unable to sleep, Zarya opened her email account and searched through years of archived messages, and what she found made her chest tighten with a dread she had never felt before. Buried in folders she had never opened were hundreds of documents, contracts, loan applications, and financial disclosures, all sent quietly to an inbox she rarely checked, all sitting there for years, like evidence waiting patiently to be discovered by someone willing to finally go looking. She scrolled through subject lines for over an hour, her coffee going cold beside her keyboard, each new file adding another layer of unease to the pile already sitting heavy in her chest. Several of the messages had been sent from addresses she did not recognize at all, generic names attached to lending institutions she had never once heard mentioned at the dinner table during 11 years of marriage. Others came directly from Ethan's own email account, forwarded quietly to himself before being buried in a folder labeled simply as archive, a word that now felt almost mocking in its plainness. She noticed, too, that many of these messages had arrived late at night, long after she had gone to bed, timestamps clustering around midnight and 1 in the morning, as though timed deliberately to avoid her attention. It was not proof of anything yet, not in any way she could bring to a court of law, but it was enough to tell her that the man sleeping beside her every night had been living a second, hidden version of their shared life. She did not confront Ethan that night, and she did not confront him the next morning either. Instead, she did what she had been trained to do for 15 years in her profession, which was to look at the numbers before trusting anyone's version of events, no matter how familiar or beloved that version might be. She downloaded every document she could find, organizing them by date and lender, building a timeline the same way she would approach a suspicious audit at work, methodical and unhurried, even as her heart pounded the entire time. Being an accountant meant she understood things most people never thought to check, like metadata, timestamps, and the digital fingerprints left behind whenever a file was created or modified on a shared computer system. Within a single evening, she discovered something that made her hands tremble over her keyboard for the first time since the federal agents had left her porch. Several signatures, supposedly signed weeks or months apart on entirely different documents, had all been generated within the exact same 60-second window, an impossibility for any real human hand holding a real pen across separate occasions. Some of the files carried an internal marker even more damning than the timestamps, a hidden trace showing they had been created and uploaded from the same internet address used at Ethan's own construction company office. Zarya stared at that detail for a long time, feeling something inside her shift from grief into something colder and more useful, something closer to resolve than sorrow. She reached out to an old colleague who had gone through a bitter divorce years earlier, and within a day she had a name and a phone number for an attorney who specialized in exactly this kind of financial deception between spouses. Attorney Naomi Ellison listened to Zarya's story without a single interruption, taking notes in careful, deliberate handwriting, her expression giving away nothing until Zarya had finished every last detail. When Zarya finally finished speaking, Naomi set down her pen and looked her directly in the eyes, with the steady focus of someone who had heard versions of this story before, but never once dismissed the person telling it. "Do not waste your energy arguing with the banks," Naomi told her, "because banks only care about repayment, not fairness, and arguing with them would only exhaust her before the real fight even began. Instead, prove the fraud, document every inconsistency, and let the evidence speak louder than any argument either of them could make in a conference room full of skeptical bankers." That same week, an email arrived in Zarya's inbox from an address she did not recognize, sent from someone identifying himself only as a former employee of Ethan's company, careful not to reveal his full name in the subject line. The message was short, almost hesitant, as though the sender had typed and deleted it several times before finally pressing send in a moment of nervous courage. "I know the truth," it read, "and I have been carrying it for a long time, longer than I should have kept it to myself." Zarya read the message 3 times before showing it to Naomi, who immediately recognized the potential significance of an insider willing to talk after months or years of silence. Within 48 hours, a meeting was arranged at a quiet coffee shop far from either of their usual routines, chosen specifically because neither of them wanted to risk being seen together by anyone connected to Ethan or his business partners. Trevor Mills arrived early, sitting with his back against the wall and his eyes on the door, the posture of a man who had spent months looking over his shoulder without fully realizing it had become habit. He had worked as the company's accountant for nearly 4 years before being let go under circumstances that, at the time, had seemed unrelated to anything sinister happening behind closed office doors. Once he began speaking, the story poured out of him in a rush, as though he had been waiting years for someone trustworthy enough to finally hear it from start to finish. Ethan, he explained, had spent the better part of 2 years scanning old signatures from real documents, building a digital library of Zarya's handwriting, pulled from years of shared paperwork and joint accounts they had once trusted completely. He had used specialized software to insert those signatures into new loan applications, forging her consent on debts she never knew existed, and when questions arose from certain lenders, he had even convinced a junior employee to falsely confirm her identity over the phone whenever verification calls came through. Trevor admitted that he had objected once, quietly, asking Ethan why so many loans needed Zarya's signature when the business itself was solely registered in his own name, and hers appeared nowhere on the official paperwork. The pushback had not gone well, and within a month Trevor found himself terminated for reasons that were never fully explained to him. His access to company systems revoked the same afternoon he was let go without warning. Fear had kept him silent for a long time afterward, worried about retaliation, worried about his own reputation being dragged into something he had only witnessed, rather than orchestrated himself. But he had not left empty-handed, having quietly preserved copies of certain emails, invoices, and even backup files from the company server before his final day, tucked away on a personal drive he had never dared to open again until now. What Trevor's evidence lacked, however, was motive, a clear reason explaining why Ethan would go to such extreme lengths to bury his own wife in debt she never agreed to carry. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that another employee had once been asked to verify Zarya's identity over the phone with a lender, reading a script prepared in advance by Ethan himself. That employee, a young woman new to the company at the time, had not questioned the request, assuming it was a routine part of confirming a joint business loan between spouses. Trevor had learned of this only later, piecing it together from a conversation overheard near the break room, and it had unsettled him enough that he began quietly saving records from that point forward. He explained that he never intended to become involved in something so serious, that he had simply wanted a paper trail in case anyone ever came asking questions about the company's finances. Now, sitting across from Zarya in a coffee shop, far from anyone who might recognize either of them, he finally understood why that instinct had mattered so much. Before the two of them parted ways that afternoon, Trevor leaned in and said something that would completely change the direction of the case moving forward. "There is still a safe," he told her. One Ethan kept hidden in the back office behind a false panel, and inside it, Trevor believed, was everything they were still missing to complete the picture. Trevor described the safe in careful detail, recalling how Ethan had installed it himself late one weekend, telling the rest of the staff it was simply for storing sensitive client contracts and nothing more unusual than that. Only 2 people had ever seen it opened, and Trevor happened to be one of them purely by accident, having walked into the back office at the wrong moment during his final month of employment. What he glimpsed in that brief instant was not contracts at all, but stacks of paper bound with rubber bands and a leather notebook. Ethan quickly moved to shield from view. At the time, Trevor had assumed it was simply private financial planning, the ordinary caution of a business owner protecting sensitive figures from casual eyes. Looking back now, knowing everything he knew, he suspected that safe held the clearest proof of intention anyone would ever find, a written record of a plan rather than just its execution. Naomi wasted no time filing for a court order to preserve evidence before Ethan had any chance to move or destroy whatever the safe contained inside its heavy steel walls. The order was granted within days, and investigators arrived at the company office alongside a locksmith, opening the safe under careful legal supervision, while Ethan watched from a distance, unable to interfere or object in front of the officers present. Inside were an external hard drive, a leather-bound notebook filled with handwritten notes, and a folder of contracts that had never been filed with any official lender or regulatory body. The hard drive alone took technicians several days to fully analyze, but the notebook told its own story almost immediately, written in Ethan's familiar cramped handwriting across dozens of carefully filled pages. Near the middle of the notebook was a page titled simply, "Assets in Case of Divorce," listing everything he intended to keep entirely for himself, separate from anything Zarya might later claim in a settlement. The house, the trucks, the retirement fund, and a modest portfolio of stocks were all listed carefully, each one marked with a note about how to keep it legally protected from any future settlement negotiation. Beneath that list was an even more chilling outline, a rough plan describing how debt could be shifted primarily onto Zarya's name over time, slowly enough that she would never notice, until it was far too late to reverse the damage already done. Once the debt was firmly attached to her, the notebook explained, divorce could follow on his terms, leaving him with clean assets and leaving her to face the financial wreckage largely alone and unprepared. Reading those pages felt like watching 11 years of marriage collapse into a cold, calculated spreadsheet of betrayal, every anniversary and quiet Sunday morning suddenly recontextualized as part of a long and patient con. Zarya did not cry when Naomi read the notebook aloud to her, though she wanted to. Instead, something inside her hardened into a resolve she had never needed before in her entire adult life. When Ethan learned that the safe had already been seized and sealed under court order, his carefully maintained composure finally began to crack in front of the people around him for the first time. Within days, Ethan hired one of the city's most aggressive divorce and business attorneys, a man known for winning cases through intimidation as much as through legal skill and careful maneuvering. The attorney's opening strategy was simple and confident, insisting publicly that every signature in question was entirely legitimate, and that Zarya herself was now attempting to dodge responsibility for debts she had willingly signed years earlier. Rumors began circulating quietly among mutual acquaintances, some suggesting Zarya had known about the loans all along and was only pretending otherwise now that the marriage was falling apart in public view. Colleagues at her firm whispered when they thought she was out of earshot, and even her own bank grew noticeably colder, tightening scrutiny on every account she still had access to, freezing certain transactions without warning. It was an uncomfortable, isolating period, the kind where a person begins to wonder if the truth alone will ever be enough to outweigh a confident enough lie, repeated often enough by people with expensive lawyers. Naomi remained unshaken through all of it, calm in every meeting, steady in every phone call, repeating the same quiet observation each time doubt crept into the room during a difficult week. "They are far too confident," she told Zaria one evening over the phone, "and overconfidence tends to make people careless in exactly the places that matter most to a careful investigator." Naomi's attorney friend once told her that fraud cases involving family members tended to attract a particular kind of public skepticism, one rooted in the assumption that spouses always know each other's business, no matter what either partner later claims. That skepticism showed itself clearly during those weeks, in the careful distance certain neighbors kept, in the polite but pointed questions coworkers occasionally asked during lunch breaks at the office. Zaria learned to answer those questions briefly and without elaboration, protecting the details of an active legal case, while still somehow managing to hold her composure in front of people who doubted her. It cost her something every single time, a small piece of energy she could not always spare, but she refused to let that cost show on her face in front of anyone watching. Naomi had warned her early on that public opinion would matter less than she expected once real evidence entered the courtroom, and Zaria clung to that promise through every uncomfortable conversation. Before the month ended, Naomi filed a formal request for an independent digital forensics examination of every disputed signature and document, a request the court granted almost immediately given the scale of the alleged fraud described in the filing. During this stretch of waiting, Zaria found herself avoiding certain rooms in the house entirely, unable to sit at the dining table where the investigators had first laid out their folder of devastating paperwork. She moved temporarily into her sister's guest room across town, telling coworkers only that she needed space to think, careful not to reveal details that might later complicate the growing legal case against her husband. Ethan called several times a day at first, his tone shifting between wounded confusion and quiet frustration, depending on how the conversation unfolded between them. She answered fewer and fewer of those calls as the days passed, letting Naomi's steady presence become the anchor she leaned on, instead of the marriage that had once served that purpose. It was a strange, suspended kind of grief, mourning a version of her husband she was no longer certain had ever truly existed outside of careful performance. The trial began on a gray autumn morning, the courthouse hallway crowded with people connected to the case in one way or another, some there out of curiosity and others out of genuine concern. Ethan sat beside his attorney in a tailored suit, playing the role of a devastated husband caught in circumstances beyond his understanding, occasionally glancing toward Zaria with an expression meant to look like quiet heartbreak rather than calculation. Trevor took the stand early in the proceedings, his voice shaking at first, before steadying as he walked the courtroom through everything he had witnessed during his years working for the company under Ethan's direct supervision. Ethan's attorney attacked him relentlessly during cross-examination, questioning his credibility, suggesting he had fabricated his story out of bitterness after being fired, painting him as a disgruntled former employee with nothing left to lose but revenge. Naomi countered patiently, methodically, presenting emails Trevor had preserved alongside internal server logs showing document creation times that lined up precisely with his testimony down to the exact minute recorded. Security footage from the company's own office cameras, quietly obtained through subpoena, showed Ethan working alone at his desk late into the night, on several dates matching the exact loan applications now in question before the court. A digital forensics expert took the stand next, walking the jury through technical details and language careful enough for anyone in the room to follow without getting lost in unnecessary jargon. Multiple signatures attributed to Zaria, the expert explained, showed clear signs of digital duplication, rather than an actual pen moving across an actual page in real time. The pressure strokes were identical down to the pixel, in places where a genuine signature would naturally vary even slightly, each and every time it was written by a living hand. Ethan's composure began slipping visibly as the testimony continued, his jaw tightening, his eyes darting occasionally toward his own attorney, as though searching for reassurance that no longer seemed to come from anywhere in the room. During a recess that same afternoon, Zaria stepped into the hallway outside the courtroom and found herself standing only a few feet away from Ethan for the first time since the trial had begun weeks earlier. Neither of them spoke at first, the silence between them heavier than any argument could have been, filled with everything 11 years together had once meant and everything those years now meant instead. He finally said her name quietly, almost pleading, as though searching for some remaining thread of the trust she had once given him so freely and completely. She looked at him for a long moment, studying the face she had once known better than her own, searching for any trace of the man she believed she had married. What she found instead was simply a stranger wearing a familiar expression, and she turned and walked back into the courtroom without offering him a single word in response. By the end of that day's session, Naomi had one final piece of evidence prepared, something she had deliberately saved until the moment it would carry the most weight in front of the judge presiding over the case. The evidence Naomi presented the following morning was a single contract, unremarkable at first glance, among the mountain of paperwork already submitted to the court over the preceding weeks. It was a supplemental agreement tied to one of the larger loans, and on this particular document, Ethan had signed using an actual pen, his signature slightly uneven in the way real handwriting always is when pressed against real paper. Zaria's signature on the very same page, however, existed only as a digital file inserted directly into the document, something the forensics expert confirmed under careful and detailed questioning from Naomi herself. Two signatures could not exist through two entirely different methods on a single page signed at what was claimed to be the exact same moment in the exact same room by two people sitting together. It was a small technical detail, easy to overlook among all the larger accusations already presented, and that was precisely why it proved so devastating once fully understood by everyone present in the courtroom. Judge Harold Whitmore, a man known throughout the courthouse for his low tolerance toward falsified documentation, studied the contract in complete silence for what felt like an unbearably long stretch of time to everyone waiting on his response. He looked up eventually, first toward the forensics expert, then slowly toward Ethan himself, his expression unreadable, but his silence somehow louder than any verbal reprimand could have been in that moment. Ethan shifted in his seat, his composure finally abandoning him entirely, sweat visible along his hairline despite the courtroom's cool temperature and the steady hum of the air conditioning overhead. His attorney whispered something to him urgently, but there was no explanation left to offer, no clever reframing. That could account for two different signing methods, appearing on a single page, at a single supposed moment in time. The room fell into a heavy, expectant quiet, everyone sensing that the balance of the entire case had just shifted permanently in one direction and would not be shifting back. Reporters seated near the back of the gallery leaned forward slightly, sensing the shift in momentum, even before the forensics expert finished explaining the technical impossibility on the record. Zaria sat perfectly still beside Naomi, her hands folded in her lap, watching the man she had once trusted, completely searched desperately for words that simply were not going to come to him. For 11 years, she had believed his silences meant patience, his careful explanations meant honesty, and now she understood that both had simply been tools he used whenever it suited him best. There was no satisfaction in watching him unravel, not the kind she might once have imagined during her angriest, most sleepless nights after the federal agents first appeared at her door. There was only a quiet, settling certainty that the truth, however long it had taken to surface, had finally made its way into a room built specifically to recognize it. Judge Whitmore closed the folder in front of him deliberately, set it aside, and announced that he would deliver his full ruling the following week after reviewing every remaining piece of evidence one final time. When the courtroom reconvened, Judge Whitmore's voice carried a firmness that left no room for interpretation or appeal on the central facts of the case, now fully laid bare. Every loan bearing Zaria's forged signature, he ruled, was declared entirely void as far as her personal liability was concerned, immediately and without exception of any kind. Ethan alone would bear full financial responsibility for every debt he had fraudulently attached to her name over the preceding years of their marriage. The judge further ordered that the case be referred for criminal investigation on charges of forgery and financial fraud, a process that would unfold separately in the months ahead under a different court. Any assets Ethan had attempted to shield through the divorce planning outlined in his own notebook were immediately frozen pending further review by the court and appointed financial examiners. The banks involved were ordered to correct every credit record connected to Zaria's name, erasing years of damage that had accumulated silently, without her knowledge or consent throughout the marriage. A murmur passed through the courtroom as the final words of the ruling were read aloud, a mixture of quiet relief and lingering disbelief settling across the gathered rows of spectators. Zaria remained still in her seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, waiting for the moment to feel triumphant, the way she had once imagined it might during her darkest nights of doubt. Instead, it felt quieter than that, more like the slow release of a breath she had been holding for months without fully realizing it. Naomi reached over and squeezed her hand once, briefly, a small gesture that carried more weight than any speech could have offered in that moment. Across the aisle, Ethan sat motionless, staring at the table in front of him, the polished composure he had worn throughout the entire trial, finally and completely gone. Ethan's world unraveled with startling speed in the weeks that followed the ruling, each new development arriving faster than the one before it. His construction company, already strained by years of hidden debt, could not survive the combination of frozen assets and a damaged reputation among clients and lenders alike, who quickly distanced themselves. Employees who had worked under him for years began quietly seeking new positions elsewhere, unwilling to stay attached to a company now publicly tied to a fraud investigation of this scale. A handful of ongoing projects were left unfinished, their contracts transferred to competing firms willing to absorb the sudden gap left behind in the local market. Vendors who had once extended him generous credit terms grew cautious overnight, requesting payment upfront on even the smallest remaining orders still on the books. What had taken Ethan more than a decade to build collapsed within a matter of months, the speed of it almost dizzying to anyone who had once considered him a steady, reliable figure in the community. The house he had so carefully listed as protected in his private notebook was eventually sold as part of the broader financial reckoning, along with the investment accounts he had believed were safely out of reach forever. Former business partners distanced themselves quickly once news of the fraud investigation became public knowledge throughout their professional circle and beyond it, phone calls going unreturned, and old friendships quietly dissolving without any formal explanation ever offered. Even members of his own extended family grew distant during that period, uncertain how to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the picture now emerging from the courtroom testimony. The confident, charming man who had once stood in doorways, offering easy reassurance, now found himself facing an uncertain future, almost entirely alone, without the safety net he had built his entire plan around. Zaria watched from a careful distance as the consequences she had once feared for herself instead settled fully onto the man who had tried so hard to force them upon her. The criminal proceedings that followed moved slower than the civil case had, winding through additional hearings and evidentiary reviews that stretched across most of the following year without much public attention. Prosecutors built their case largely from the same forensic evidence Naomi had already assembled, supplementing it with additional testimony from bank employees who had unknowingly processed the fraudulent paperwork years earlier. Ethan's attorney negotiated where he could, but the weight of the digital evidence left little room for maneuvering once the forgery charges were formally filed against his client. Word of the case eventually reached a few local business publications, brief mentions buried in longer articles about fraud within the regional construction industry, though Zaria mostly avoided reading them herself. She had already lived through every detail once in person, and she found she had little need to relive it again through the careful, distant language of a news column. Several months passed before Zaria felt anything resembling stability return to her daily life, and even then it arrived slowly, in small and quiet increments. She returned fully to her work as a senior accountant, where colleagues who had once whispered doubts now greeted her with quiet respect for the strength she had shown throughout the entire ordeal from beginning to end. Using nothing but her own restored income and her own name, she purchased a modest apartment closer to downtown, choosing every detail of it herself for the first time in over a decade of shared decisions. Naomi visited once during the final stages of the divorce paperwork, and over coffee she offered Zaria a piece of reflection that stayed with her long after that afternoon ended and the paperwork was signed. "The most valuable thing you have reclaimed," Naomi said, "was never really about the money at all, though the money mattered too in its own way. It was your right to trust the truth again, even after someone you loved tried so hard and for so long to convince you otherwise." Zaria thought about those words often in the weeks that followed, turning them over the way she once turned over columns of numbers, searching for the deeper meaning hidden beneath the surface. She began seeing a therapist recommended by a coworker, someone experienced in helping people rebuild their sense of judgment after living through prolonged deception at the hands of someone they trusted completely. It was slow work, more difficult in some ways than the courtroom battle had been, learning to trust her own instincts again after discovering how thoroughly they had once been overridden by affection and habit. Little by little, she noticed herself returning to old routines with a new kind of confidence, reviewing her own bank statements line by line each month, not out of fear anymore, but out of quiet, steady ownership. Friends noticed the change before she fully recognized it herself, commenting on a certain lightness that had crept back into her voice during phone calls and weekend visits. She was, slowly and deliberately, becoming someone whole again, rebuilt not from what had been taken from her, but from what she had refused to let go of throughout the entire ordeal. Zaria signed the final divorce papers on a quiet Thursday afternoon, her hand steady, her expression calm in a way that surprised even herself as she set the pen down for the last time. There was no lingering anger left in her by that point, no fear trailing behind her into the parking lot outside the courthouse where the whole ordeal had finally reached its conclusion. She walked out through the tall glass doors as afternoon light spilled warmly across the courthouse steps, casting long shadows that stretched peacefully behind her like something finally settling into place. He had once believed that placing her name on every debt he created would be enough to steal her entire future out from under her without her ever noticing. In the end, it was his own greed that stripped him of everything he had tried so desperately to protect for himself, piece by piece, until nothing remained. Justice rarely arrives quickly, and it rarely arrives exactly when it is needed most. But when it finally does arrive, it tends to overlook no one standing in its path, no matter how carefully they once believed themselves hidden. A year after the ruling, Zaria stood in her new kitchen on a quiet Sunday morning, coffee brewing on the counter, sunlight spilling gently across a table that belonged entirely to her. There were no folders waiting to be opened, no signatures to question, no quiet dread sitting beneath the surface of an ordinary morning like there once had been. She thought sometimes about the version of herself who had opened that door at 6 o'clock on an ordinary Tuesday, unaware that her entire life was about to be tested down to its foundation. That version of her had survived, and more than that, she had learned something no amount of comfort could have taught her on its own, something about the quiet strength required to rebuild trust from the ground up. The past no longer felt like a wound she carried, but simply a chapter she had closed with steady hands and a clear conscience. She poured her coffee, sat down at her own table in her own home, and let the morning unfold exactly as it should, peacefully and entirely on her own terms.